Just like it was happening with Spirit Blossom, Riot recently started releasing stories that slowly lead into the next big event. And while the Spirit Blossom event got stories such as Perennial or Brotherhood, so far for the Ruination we got a story about Kalista, and a week later we got a story about Hecarim in Demacia. So to go with the stories chronologically, today we will have a look at what Kalista is currently doing on Runeterra. So without further ado, here's the story in Sight of Land. The story happens on the eastern seas. The waters were still like a piece of flawless glass, and it reflected the sky. It was darkened by tendrils of shadow that branched across the night like living malevolent storms. By this time, people were used to the harrowing. How every now and then the black mist reached out to release the monsters of the Shadow Isles upon the living. But what was happening now, what reached up to swallow the sky, was something different. It felt almost as if an unseen hand guided it. That night, on the surface of the glass-like water, there were pieces of splintered wood, torn cloth, and the bodies of the newly dead. Among them, a man called Tudre mustered his remaining strength to hold onto a piece of driftwood. In the first hour after the disaster, Tudre screamed himself hoarse, calling out to anyone else who might have survived, but no one else did. He was alone. Below him, he could almost hear the icy depths calling up to him to join all the others, her silver tongue carrying the promise of sleep if he would just draw her water into his lungs. Tudre couldn't feel his legs anymore, but he still moved them through sheer will. He just had to get to land. He had sailed with all speed to get to Folgren, which was a small island in the Noxian territory, so by now Tudre thought he couldn't be far. As he floated forward with the vision of his one good eye blurry, a piece of oiled paper drifted close to him. It was smeared by water, yet still legible. It turned out it was their navigation chart. Attached to it was an old map of trade routes, with measurements of marine time distance. Some places on it were known, others were secret. There were crude drawings of clouds with faces, breathing out gusts from between their lips to mark the best lanes where the winds might bless a ship with speedy passage, for those who dared. Then the story cuts into a flashback. "You're insane," Tudre snorted. The seas were getting rougher, and he didn't have time to listen to his quartermaster's nonsense. The quartermaster, Mr. Bowsy as Tudre called him, thought that the route they were taking would get them killed. In return, Tudre just mocked him and called him an old man. He pointed at the red line on the map and explained that they would go fast and they would get rich. All the other ships were docked. There was no one that could ambush them, no one that could get the treasures before them, no one that could protect their own treasures. Bowsy snapped back that all of them were docked because it was the harrowing, and the biggest one anyone had ever seen at that. Tudre straightened up, looked his quartermaster in the eye, and with deep voice, he said that anyone who wants is free to leave. At least that would mean more treasure for the rest. But regardless, they were going out. Bowsy tried one last time, and he told Tudre to at least let the crew vote on it. But Tudre replied, "Not this time." After a pause, Tudre asked his quartermaster, "Now, you in or not?" The flashback then goes back to reality. Tudre shook his head to get the memory from his mind, but all it did was get him dizzy. The memory still remained, as if someone wanted him to see it. That's when he felt a new kind of strangeness. It was an insistent sense of dread and anger, seeking to work guilt into his bones. "Boats made for sailing. Ask any man." Tudre wheezed through chittering teeth. "I done that run dozen of times. See a chance at fortune? Ya take it. Can't live this life if you ain't a daring sort." Tudre said it with the same bravado he had carried his entire life. It was the attitude that led him rise to a captain of his own ship. The high seas were unkind to the weak, as was Bilgewater and any big port whose doors he had ever darkened. Pass on an opportunity, and you might look back and see it was the last chance you had to hold onto your stakes, or keep your guts in your belly. But out in this night, and this cold, there was no one to be caught by his speech, only the dread that rolled up from the deep. it persisted, undiminished. Land is close, Tudre told himself. It has to be. Tudre had not realized he was moving. Around him there were other means of sailing, such as a blot of sailcloth, but Tudre knew it could be more of a hazard than a savior. He had seen many panicked sailors ensnared by these in storms. Tudre became concerned as the sailcloth drifted closer. He put out a hand, trying to push it away, but his arm sank into it elbow deep, stealing his balance. He snarled through clenched teeth, fighting the sails. That's when the story cuts into another flashback. There was a storm, and Tudre was shouting at his men to hold fast. He didn't know if anyone could hear his orders. There was rain and spray and shadows that lashed the deck, the sails, and the crew. Gales roared over them, not with wind, but with voices, a howling chorus of the damned. His ship was fast, but not fast enough to stay ahead of it. The ship's hold was full of treasures. The crew got it from the coastal shores. The anchored trade ships were unguarded. Their keepers abandoned them as they fled the harrowing. It was a fortune easily gained, but that fortune was now slowing them down. Tudre knew Bowsy would curse him for not listening to him, but Bowsy was the first man who was plucked by the darkness. Tudre turned around and saw Fleer, a boy who was trying his best to hold onto the bolt of sail. Fleer was fighting desperately to tie the sail down so it wouldn't snap loose, but he was obviously losing the fight. Tudre locked eyes with Fleer. The boy pleaded for his help as the oiled cloth whipped around. Tudre hesitated whether he should help him, but after he saw splinters fly from the base of the ship, all doubt fled. A blink of an eye later, the timber snapped and Fleer was flung into the roiling dark. Tudre saw his eyes, wide in terror as he flew into a cloud of twisted faces and outstretched clutching hands. A heartbeat later, the boy vanished. Just one more scream added to the chorus. The flashback then cuts back to reality. Better him than I. Tudre snarled against the silent accusation of the sea. He felt the pressure of it in his skull, the feeling of being watched even though he was alone. The sailcloth tangled around his forearm, holding tighter the more he tried to escape. Better him, he replied, glaring down at the scrap of sail clinging to his hand. Than I. Why? The cloth encircling his wrist seemed to ask. Tudre shivered, but not from the cold. The mind was playing tricks now, beaten and worn out and desperate as he was. He tried to yank his arm free, but stopped midway as he nearly lost hold of the driftwood. Tudre sped out that he was the captain. He was in charge of the entire ship and the crew, not just one boy. If he ran off to help him and got snatched up too, what would happen to the rest of the crew without him? For a moment, anger got the best of Tudre. He quickly yanked his arm back, finally freeing himself from the sail's hold. But only a second later, his own grip on the driftwood also gave up, letting him sink under the water. There, in the cold, silence rushed over him. Even through the numbness, he tried to pump his arms and legs, but he couldn't. With his good eye, he looked around and saw the lighter pieces of the ship among the darkness. And with them, there were the bodies of the men and women who called him a captain, who relied on him, and whom he had betrayed. Tudre's panic led to strength, which finally let him get back to surface and grab onto the driftwood. It was then that Tudre realized what he was holding onto. It was a part of a lifeboat. One of the lifeboats that... Then we get another flashback. Someone was screaming that they should get into the lifeboats to abandon the ship. There were things on board of the ship. Wretched, horrible, blighted beasts. They stalked through the torrent without effort, undisturbed by the storm as they got at Tudre's crew. Tudre's crew were all seasoned pirates. They were all decked with more weapons strapped onto them than they had hands to carry. But they still fell to the wraiths like wheat before the scythe. The men and women that Tudre had seen hunt great leviathans were now begging like children to monsters that didn't understand mercy. Tudre punched and shoved his way through the mass of panicked faces crawling around the few leaky lifeboats the ship had. Tudre tried to hop into one of them, but one of his crewmates stopped him. The lifeboat was full. One more body and it would roll them all down below. They couldn't risk it. In response, Tudre grabbed the man by the back of his neck, and he stabbed him with his cutlass. In one smooth motion, he then withdrew the blade and pitched the lifeless body over the side. "There," he hissed. "One body fewer. Now cast off!" The flashback then once again goes back to reality. "I be a survivor," Tudre argued, though the strength was missing from his words. "The strong live on, and the weak die. I chose life, a chance at it, for everyone in that boat. Rather than capsizing it and leaving all to drown, they at least had the chance." He didn't know who he was trying to convince anymore. The sense of guilt that had become a voice was now many, thundering in his mind like broadside cannon. "You did this. Our lives forfeit. Your greed killed us all. Murder, turncoat." The moon's light was nearly gone. Now there was only a blurred strip on the horizon. His soul flared with delirious hope. "Land," he gasped. At first, Tudre laughed hysterically, before it was interrupted by a dark shape that formed behind him. Then they were all around him. It was the flesh of his crew that now surrounded him. "I never did you ill," said Tudre, his voice shaking. "Anything we did was for your fortune as much as mine. All of you knew the risks. You'd have done the same as me." The voices assailing Tudre seemed to emanate from the corpses. Their cries buffeted him, stripping his nerves bare. "Stop," he pleaded. "I beg ye." But they would not cease. They merged into a single terrible chorus, repeating a single word like a dirge to drive down and bury in Tudre's heart. "Betrayer!" Tudre screamed back in denial. As one, the spirits of Tudre's crew sat up, peeling away from their bodies. Fleer, Bowsy, all of them stared at Tudre with clouded eyes. Tudre could feel their rage. Suddenly, the driftwood sank a little, and he found himself staring in the face of death. It was a woman, tall and graceful, standing on top of the driftwood. Where her flesh should have been was instead smoldering spectral blue energy. She wore battered armor and a helm with long black plume. A trio of spears had been driven through her chest. The sight of her turned Tudre's inside cold and leaden. Everyone knew the legends, the whispered things a man could laugh off as stories meant to scare children, stories of an avatar of revenge, appearing wherever injustice had been done, and voices cried out for vindication. They cried out for Lady of Vengeance, and with spear in hand, she would answer with damnation. Tudre's crew came closer, the woman's eerie light reflected in their blazing sapphire eyes. Once again, Tudre pleaded for mercy, as they cut off the sight of land in front of him. "I was only trying to make me way in this world. My crew didn't deserve their fate, no, but nor did I deserve this. You don't know what it'd be like, leading those in your command to their doom, to be responsible for the damnation of their very souls." Sudden life was brought to her cold, unreadable features, almost as if there was a sound in the distance that only she could hear. The woman glared down at Tudre, boring into the core of him. Rage twisted her face in an instant, and then it was gone. Slowly, she lowered her spear, resting it just under Tudre's throat. She pushed, though not with enough pressure to pierce his flesh and impale him, just enough to separate him from the driftwood and push him under the water. Tudre's mind screamed to fight, the urge to survive willing him to rise, but he could not. The spear tip at his throat held him beneath. Tudre looked up at the shimmering, dispassionate visage. Lady Vengeance had come for him at last. The voices had all gone silent. His crew sank down with him, closing around him like fingers making a fist. All light faded. Tudre finally succumbed to the deep and drew her into his lungs. At last, bubbles slipped from his lips as he drifted lower into the darkness, and he went down, just in sight of land. And that was the very first story to prepare us for the Ruination. As you can see, even though most of the time Kalista is on the Shadow Isles, hunting down the remaining specters of Hecarim, just like she's supposed to, she also listens to those who cry for vengeance, and she is ready to strike down any betrayers in reach of the Black Mist. But while this story revealed that the mist is rolling towards Noxus, guided by an unseen hand, in the next story, we will learn that it is also rolling over the other side of the main continent. There we will learn about what is happening in Demacia.